morning, everyone. Morning. So we're about to get started with this morning's sessions. A couple of announcements before we get going, and I hand over to our chair for this morning, Caoimhe Gleeson. First, unfortunately, Mia Ives-Rubli is not able to join us this morning, so I've been drafted in to give a presentation instead, also on reproductive justice on a project that we did here at the university. And the other thing I just wanted to say is that given the topics that we're talking about today, obviously we're talking about reproductive justice, we're talking about health, and we're talking about gender-based violence. And these are, as many of the discussions we've already had this week, really sensitive topics and people will be talking about personal experience for them as well. So we just need to be mindful of that. We need to be respectful of people's personal experiences and just, take care of ourselves and each other. If anyone needs a break or not to sit in on certain discussions, that's absolutely fine. We understand. So just wanted to say that before I hand over to Caoimhe.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yep. So we have 4 speakers with us this morning. The session is on reproductive justice. Eleanor has stepped in for Mia, so we'll start with Eleanor, then we'll have Hannah Gibson online, Sarah Rocha, who's also going to join us online, and then finally we'll have Maho Rivas, who's here with us. So we'll start with Eleanor. Many of you know Eleanor. Eleanor is the established chair in law, and she's the director of the Centre for Disability Law and Policy here at NUI Galway. And Eleanor's research focuses on disability and social justice, with a particular emphasis on legal capacity, advocacy, and reproductive justice. So Eleanor, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Caoimhe. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project that we worked on here at the university. So it was called the Real Productive Justice Project, and the title for my talk this morning is Reproductive Justice is Disability Justice. So this morning I'll be sharing some findings from that research that we did, focused on Ireland and focused on disabled people's experiences in the project we looked at everything from access to contraception, from fertility management, to abortion access, to pregnancy and birth and parenting. So we really tried to span the whole spectrum of the reproductive journeys that disabled people may have been on. But I could be here all day if I was to tell you about every single thing we discovered in the project. So this morning, I'm just going to focus on people's experiences of maternity care. So I should say at the outset as well that for this project, when we talk about reproductive justice, we very much draw on the understanding of that concept that comes from Black women in the southern US, particularly the Sister Song Collective, who described reproductive justice as not just about access to abortion, which is often conflated with, but about everything, the decision whether to have a child or not have a child, and the ability to parent the children that we do have safely and sustainably in our communities. So I think that's a much richer understanding of the concept, and that was what we used to guide us during the research. We carried out oral histories with disabled people in Ireland, all different types of disabled people. So we would have had people with chronic illness, people with psychosocial disability, deaf people, people with physical impairment, people who were blind or had low vision. So it was a really, really rich set of oral histories, and we have made those oral histories public in the Digital Repository of Ireland. So now they're available for anyone to read who's interested in the topic. And we also interviewed 27 professionals or staff working across health and social care and the legal profession, including judges who would be dealing with cases in the family courts about the removal of children potentially from disabled parents. And we wanted to get an understanding from their perspective of what the barriers and enablers were for people along their reproductive journeys. At the end of the project, we published, in addition to the academic work of the project, which is still ongoing, we published these toolkits, which are a more practical resource, and that's why I'm telling you about them, given our focus at summer school on solutions. And the toolkits cover all the individual topics that we looked at in the project. So we have one on fertility and contraception, one on abortion, one on pregnancy and birth, and one on parenting. And we also have a communication toolkit, which is designed for healthcare practitioners or social care or legal practitioners if they're encountering a disabled person who is facing some barriers in their reproductive journey, how to communicate with them about the things that they may need. And we then published a Know Your Rights guide for disabled people as well. So these are the key overarching themes that we uncovered in the project. So we were very focused on the idea of barriers and also enablers. And the barriers that we found will be no surprise to any of you. Obviously, people encountered a lot of ableist attitudes and ableist experiences in the health and social care and legal systems regarding their reproductive decision making. But there was internalized ableism as well. So to the point where people felt that because of everything society had told them, they started to believe it and started to believe that they would not be able to do some of the things that they really wanted to do. We found a lot of issues with inaccessible environments, and that includes inaccessible communication, and it also includes inaccessible sensory environments. So I think anyone who's encountered a hospital setting knows that it can be a sensory nightmare as well as a physical access nightmare. And so these were real issues for people that we spoke to in the project. Many disabled people described the higher standards that they felt were imposed on disabled pregnant people in particular, compared with non-disabled pregnant people. And so we use this concept of the labor of access throughout the project. So, we have this idea that not only are disabled people facing barriers, but they have to bring all the solutions with them, and they have to do all the work to get people to understand what needs to be changed. And they do this over and over every time, every interaction. And it's a huge amount of labor. And if you add that to all the reproductive labor that people are also doing in this process, it becomes really, really challenging. On the flip side, then, the enablers that we found included that when things worked well, it was because there was information sharing among the different people and the different teams involved in the person's care or in the person's legal situation. And where that information sharing was effective, it was because it was based on consent. So we did have examples of information being shared without consent, which people were understandably very upset by, and based on respect for the individual's rights. Really important when things worked well was that disabled people's agency was recognized and their expertise on their own body minds was acknowledged and respected. And other enablers that we talked about were anticipatory accessibility, so building things in from the beginning, not waiting for a disabled person to come and look for something, having things there from the beginning, and support and the development of creative solutions. So I'm just going to share some quotes with you now from the different participants that I think illustrate some of these barriers really clearly. So here's a quote on ableism from Nadine, who is a blind woman. I was in a room on my own for health and safety, just so that people wouldn't put things in the way, and I'd trip over it and that kind of stuff. And very soon this nurse was asking, where was my carer? So of course I said, what carer, Do you not have a carer that takes, care of you at home? I said, absolutely not. I'm an independent person. I run the household. And then, is your partner not staying? I thought that was perfectly fine to ask because I know there's some people would stay and blah, blah, blah. And I realized that the connotation was that your partner needs to be here caring for you, which again, fair enough. I just had a C-section. That's perfectly acceptable. But then I decided that wasn't the way she was going and I dropped the bombshell. Oh my goodness, Daddy is blind too. Well, I could nearly hear her calling social services. So I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Bernie, a woman with intellectual disability in the project, talked about how when she became pregnant, she was living in disability services, in residential services, and she felt, again, because of internalized ableism and everything she had been told about herself and her ability, that she needed to proactively let the Child and Family Agency, so like Child Protective Services in our context, know that she was pregnant as a disabled woman. Just, that was it. And when she told us this, we were quite shocked that this was something she felt she needed to do. So TUSLA is the name of our Child Protective Services or Child and Family Agency. Bernie said, before TUSLA even got involved, I was like, well, we had to because I'm disabled, we had to let TUSLA know that I was pregnant, obviously. Interviewer, so who said you had to let TUSLA know? Disability service provider, is it? Bernie, no, I just felt myself that I needed to let Thusla know, you know, and disability service provider said that as well. Okay, so there was a social worker involved from the very beginning of my pregnancy until the time I had Alana from Thusla, like, and the disability service provider, obviously. And Bernie faced a number of other barriers in her pregnancy and parenting journey, including the fact that the disability service provider was not able to accommodate her once she had her child. So she was made homeless and she had to undergo parenting capacity assessments and had to, you know, make herself homeless before she would actually get the support that she needed to find social housing and to have a safe place for her and her child to live. So again, this is an abject failure, I think, of the structures in our health and social care systems that enabled that situation to happen. Lexi, who is neurodivergent, talked about how difficult it was to be in hospital. She said, I mean, I hated going in, I hated it. But you go in there because you need someone to check your baby, so you stay. But I mean, the amount of times, every time, I wanted to run out. Like half an hour, it's bright, it's noisy, people are all close by you. And so I'd spend all my time scripting what I was going to say. So I find the environment severe, like that has severe impact on me. But I actually think that for a couple of weeks afterwards, that would have a severe impact on me physically, probably as well as mentally. Elaine, a deaf woman in the project, talked about her experience with inaccessible communication in the health service. She said, I remember with the hospital, you know, I had no interpreters for the scans or anything. And I remember the scan happening. The doctors were in and out, and I'm just lying there. I didn't know what was going on. Absolute breakdown in communication. And then they just said, no, you don't have a baby. And I thought, you know, it was like normal that, you know. And then again, it was no baby. And, you know, I think I blanked out, you know. I moved to a different room, like, no, they definitely don't have a baby. And I think I remember one of the nurses had a tiny bit of sign and she came in and she just spelled her name, I think it was, and that was it. I remember she was a lovely woman, don't get me wrong. I'm not criticizing her, you know, but she thought she had sign language. She didn't. She could just spell her name. But she had kind of said to me to stop crying, you'll have another baby in the future. And I remember I was a bit, huh? Hang on. I grieved for a long time after that. Another different Elaine in the project with a physical disability talked about how she felt higher standards were imposed on her in her pregnancy and in her parenting. Before they let me leave the hospital with Imogen, I had to change her nappy, dress her, undress her, change her nappy and dress her in front of 2 physiotherapists, an occupational therapist, the senior nurse on the ward, and somebody else. Now, what other able-bodied mother? And I wasn't able to do it. I broke down. I wasn't able to do it. And to be fair to the physiotherapist, they wanted to release me after 5 days. And she came down and said, you're not ready. I want you to stay here. And of course, because they needed the bed, they were like, so the physiotherapist said, let's change her. She just wanted herself, myself, Sean, and her to be there. But no, of course, they insisted on having 10 eyes in front of me, and I wasn't able to do it. So just on this labour of access point, Claire, who also had a physical disability, said this, I'd love to see that, you know, really places where it's easy to go and find out about the equipment. Like you just can't, like if I now, even now, know like someone to tell me about the most accessible equipment. You know, it took me ages to research the buggy, the car seats, you know, there's so many of them that just won't suit me. I also think, you know, in my hospital, I would have, you know, I'd love to see sometimes a disabled member of staff working there who then might think of things from my perspective, you know. So the final point I want to kind of end with is around recognizing agency. And I have some quotes here about how that happened. Instead of sitting with myself and Sean and saying, you have lived with these disabilities for the last 30 odd years, what do you think you should do? There was never any discussion of what we should do. What do you think would help? What do you need? That question was never asked. And Selena, who I mentioned at the beginning of the week because she has died since this project ended, she said, as a wheelchair user, you become a very creative thinker and a great problem solver. When I drove, I always kept kitchen tongs in the door of my car. I'd use it to reach the parking ticket. I'm sure the person in the car behind me is going, what the hell is that driver doing? But it made my life easier and more accessible. So Selena was always a really big advocate of the fact that disabled people are problem solvers and have the solutions. But again, it's about working in partnership, and it's about that kind of agency being recognised. And so when people were able to show that there were ideas, enablers and things that worked well, things that actually helped them, it was usually one individual, one person they met who was willing to work with them and figure things out. And again, people's access should not depend on, one person being sound. So Elaine said about a physiotherapist that she worked with during this process. She said, look, I hold my hands up. I've never dealt with this situation before, but I think I was about 3 or 4 months pregnant at this stage. And she said, let's work together and let's come up with solutions so that by the time you're ready to have the baby, you'll be able to manage. You mightn't be able to manage 100%, but you'll have techniques. Okay, so I'm going to end it there in terms of just, I suppose, platforming the voices of the people who were generous enough to share their stories with us. And I have resources like the toolkits and the oral history archive that will be made available to everyone here. And of course, you're also welcome to email me and ask any questions you have about the research. Thanks.
Thank you, Eleanor. Eleanor is going to leave us for a short while, but we'll return. And just to say thank you to Eleanor, and I suppose you'll agree, those are very powerful stories. And I'm sure, for those that it speaks to, it's quite difficult to take some of that in. And even as a woman, a not disabled woman, they're quite painful stories to listen to. So I suppose give yourself a moment if you need that moment to kind of absorb some of that as well. So we're going to move on now to Hannah Gibson, who is from the University of Barcelona. Hannah is going to join us online. And Hannah is going to speak about the barriers to sexual and reproductive health care for women with intellectual disabilities in Spain. Hannah is a medical anthropologist whose work over the last 11 years has spanned research on horse-assisted psychotherapy, surrogacy, mothering, vulnerability, reproductive justice and disability rights. So we're delighted to welcome Dr. Hannah Gibson. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hannah and I am an anthropologist and Marie Curie Fellow based at the Autonomous University of Barcelona in Spain. This paper today is based on a 2-year anthropological project in which I'm exploring Spanish women with intellectual disabilities' diverse experiences of reproductive control and autonomy, including whether they feel empowered to make decisions about their reproductive and sexual health care and lives. I am including the perspectives of those women who are mothers and those who do not have children, whether through choice or not, to compare and identify the similarities and differences between and within the two groups. A key goal is to co-produce different and collaborative artistic outputs in which participants can share their stories how they want to. As a secondary goal, I hope to use speculative fiction as a tool to reimagine what reproductive justice might look like for women with intellectual disability. Right now, I am a third the way through my data collection, and so this paper is a bit of a snapshot of what I have learned thus far after spending time with 25 women with intellectual disability and conducting in-depth interviews with 8 of them. A few notes first. I use the term woman with intellectual disability and not intellectually disabled woman because it is a more accurate translation of terminology used in Spain by participants and support organizations. Also, when translating quotes into English, I've tried to capture the meaning and sentiment behind words as accurately as possible. Lastly, as a trigger warning, this talk does include references to reproductive control, coercion, and different forms of violence. To first set the scene, Spain abolished forced sterilization in 2020, a practice condemned by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability and the Istanbul Convention as an act of violence against the fundamental rights and bodies of disabled people, particularly girls and women. In the case of women, sterilization refers to tubal ligation, an irreversible procedure in which fallopian tubes are cut, tied, or blocked to permanently prevent pregnancy. Before the ban, judges could authorize forced sterilizations for those deemed legally incapable of giving consent, often targeting women with intellectual disabilities the most. In the decade before this prohibition, about 1,000 cases of involuntary or forced sterilization were approved. This figure excludes those cases where women may have been coerced to consent by families and doctors. It's also important to acknowledge that in comparison to other groups, women with disability experience a higher rate of targeted and multiple forms of invisible violence and maltreatment, including economic exploitation, isolation, as well as psychological, physical, and sexual abuse. Thus, whilst this ban has been a significant step, forced sterilization has always been part of a wider denial of women's reproductive rights. This includes situations where they are pressured to use long-term contraceptives without fully understanding why, being coerced into abortions, or being discouraged or barred from spending time with their partners. Further, sterilization can still be performed if a woman gives her informed consent, although there remains the risk of women being coerced by families or others to consent. Advocates in this field told me that changing laws is not enough. Cultural and systemic ableism can be pervasive and hard to change quickly. When I interviewed Monica, aged 35, she shared her dream of marrying her partner once they could find suitable housing, which her mother always supported. When asked if she wanted children, Monica responded, "Well, yes, I do, but I can't because I had an operation." She waved her hand across her midsection, explaining, "They cut my tubes when I was 21. Monica said she ultimately made the decision with her mother, who thought she would struggle with pregnancy and childbirth, as well as aspects of caring for a baby. Yet Monica never told her mother that part of her is frustrated and regrets the operation, telling me, "I see mothers with their babies and it hurts me here," placing her closed fist against her chest. Later, as she explored how this impacts her life, she brightened up, saying, "But my mother said I can adopt later and have a baby that way, so maybe I can be a mum." Through these contradictory messages, telling Monica she wouldn't be a capable mother, but promising the option of adoption later, her mother coerced her, intentionally or not, into consenting to be sterilized. And unfortunately, the promise of adopting is very unlikely to ever be approved, as research and anecdotal evidence shows women with intellectual disability who give birth face higher scrutiny and risk of losing custody because they're judged to be unable to provide adequate care even before they give birth. Additionally, some women with intellectual disability are often infantilized their whole lives by different people and services, whereby it becomes normal that others make everyday and more complex decisions for them. In the case of Monica, she trusted her mother, even if she regrets the decision made now. And this dominant and ableist narrative at the intersection of intellectual disability, gender, and reproduction is based on the idea that women with intellectual disability are incapable of being a good mother, due not to all the challenges and barriers they experience, but because of their disability. And we know how troubling any reference to good mothering is, not to mention how subjective the term is. When alongside other negative stereotypes and stigmatization, this leads to discrimination, the denial of full citizenship, precarious employment and housing, and lack of access to appropriate healthcare and resources. Collectively, when society, medical systems, state policies, and assisted reproductive medicine all promote, whether covertly or overtly, the idea that disability is a deficit, that disabled people should not reproduce, and they would make bad parents, it takes a lot to shift these narratives and the discrimination women experience. During fieldwork, it was interesting to learn from experts and participants themselves how women often take on caring roles in families or outside the home. Several younger women, including Monica, work part-time in child-caring facilities such as kindergartens, a job which they enjoy but are paid little. And yet, at least in Monica's case, what gave me pause was how she looks after the children of other mothers, whilst her own, alongside society, deems her incapable of having and looking after one of her own. It makes me reflect on how these women may inhabit traditional gendered care roles in one aspect, but are simultaneously barred from some experiences that they may want to have. I heard multiple accounts of women being disregarded in medical settings. During a women's group session with about 16 women, only one had ever had a pap smear or gynecological exam. One participant shared that during a doctor's appointment she attended with her mother, the doctor offered her mother an exam, but not her, making her wonder if he didn't see her as a woman. In an interview, one participant mentioned that her support worker often speaks for her at appointments, explaining, "I tell them, why are you telling my story? I should speak for myself, but they keep talking for me." This disregard, dehumanization, and lack of access to comprehensive and accessible sexual and reproductive health care and education means that women are not getting the tools that they need to make informed decisions about their own bodies, desires, and futures. At the heart of the stories was the desire for women to have autonomy over their bodies and lives. And whilst their personal goals were diverse, the one similar thread was their conviction that they do not lack the ability or right to decide, but experience discrimination that often stops them or denies them this right. With this in mind, I want to end with a few examples of women finding their own ways to achieve their reproductive goals. One participant, a mother with intellectual disability, whose child is 2 years old, waited until she was 4 months pregnant to tell her parents because she said they would force her to abort, which, whilst highlighting the complexities of not feeling like she had full reproductive autonomy, is also an act of resistance, a way to achieve her dreams, being fully aware that she lives in a society that actively discourages women such as herself to not have children. Secondly, some women attend courses support organizations provide to become advocates for women's rights. And mothers have been collaborating in the co-creation of resources for new mothers or others considering it so that others can benefit from what they've learned. Such resources are not only sharing wisdom and provide accessible parenting advice, but also are producing a counter-narrative that people with intellectual disability can and do succeed as parents. Lastly, in the majority of stories I have heard, women were very aware that becoming a mother required access to housing and income and support, which are not easy to obtain. Some have supportive families who can help, whilst others do not. And some participants have decided against motherhood because of these challenges, even though some may have wanted to be mothers. Those who are mothers described how, like those without disability, they had to learn to become a mother, and that needing extra support because of their disability did not mean they couldn't fulfill the role. As someone aptly put, everyone needs support, disabled or non-disabled. Some need more, some need less, but we still have the right to be mothers if we want to. Thank you for listening to some of my reflections at the midway point of learning from and bearing witness to the reproductive stories of Spanish women with intellectual disabilities. It has been a pleasure. Hi, my name is Hannah, and
Thank you, Hannah, for another, I think you'll agree, powerful example of profound barriers that women with intellectual disability in Spain face in relation to sexual and reproductive health care. We're going to move on now to another online presenter, Sara Rocha, who's from the Associação Portuguesa Voz do Autista. And Sara is, just bear with me, Sara is a neurodivergent and disabled advocate. She's vice chair of the Women's Committee of the European Disability Forum, where she's the representative of the European Council of Autistic People, where she is the vice president. So over to Sara, and thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sara Rocha. I'm an autistic and disabled advocate fighting in Europe to criminalize forced sterilization. And today I'll be speaking to you on how to end forced sterilization, approaching disability-led reproductive justice, and how the Maltese government changed their legislation to criminalize this practice. I co-wrote this with Alistair De Gaetano, an autistic lawyer and chair of Autism Advisory Council in Malta, and one of the biggest driving forces for these law changes. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for hearing us talk about this issue, and I'm available for questions later. So I'll start by the status of forced sterilization in member states. There are only 11 countries in the EU that allow by law forced sterilization for persons with disabilities. 3 countries, Portugal, Czechia, and Hungary, allowing it in minors. This eugenic practice is especially prevalent in women and girls with disability, particularly with psychosocial or intellectual disabilities. You can see here a small map. The gray ones we don't have information, and the green ones are criminalized. Light red is allowed for adults, and strong red is allowed for minors and adults. So the EU recently had the opportunity to criminalize it for all of their state members through the Directive on Combating Violence Against Women. However, forced sterilization was removed from the directive in the last minute of the negotiations, signaling to all women with disabilities that a human rights violation that affects them specifically is not considered, might not consider violence against women. While Parliament supported including this ground, the Council of the EU argued that the EU did not have competence to legislate, since such a crime lacked the necessary cross-border effects. However, given that other practices, such as rape and female genital mutilation, are widely covered by this text, the possibility of forum shopping by parents seeking the least restrictive jurisdiction to potentially practice the procedure on their children, and the obligation in the Istanbul Convention already binding certain EU member states such an argument is tenuous at best. Several human rights bodies and treaties recognize sterilization of persons with disabilities as a form of discrimination and a form of violence and degrading treatment. I'll be speaking of some of the treaties next, which is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability affirms the right of persons with disabilities to found and maintain a family and to retain their fertility through Article 23, where they say state parties shall take effective and appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against persons with disabilities in all matters relating to marriage, family, parenthood, and relationships on an equal basis with others, so as to ensure that, and one of the points is persons with disabilities, including children, retain their fertility on an equal basis with others. Also, in the Convention General Comment number 1 of 2014 on Article 12, equal recognition before the law says, states parties must holistically examine all areas of law to ensure that the rights of persons with disabilities to legal capacity is not restricted on an unequal basis with others. Historically, persons with disabilities have been denied their right to legal capacity in many areas in a discriminatory manner under substitute decision-making regimes such as guardianship, conservatorship, and mental health laws that permit forced treatment. This practice must be abolished in order to ensure that full legal capacity is restored to persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others. Another treaty that covers it is Istanbul Convention, which in Article 39 that covers forced abortion and forced sterilization, and it says, parties shall take the necessary legislative and other measures to ensure that the following intentional conducts are criminalized. And one of the points is performing surgery which has the purpose or effect of terminating a woman's capacity to naturally reproduce without her prior and informed consent or understanding of the procedure. The program of action adopted at the International Conference on Population and Development Program of Action in 1994 and the 2014 call from 7 UN agencies on eliminating forced, coercive, and otherwise involuntary sterilization mentioned forced sterilization as a human rights violation. And finally, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child has specifically addressed forced sterilization of persons with disabilities under the age of 18 as a form of physical violence. However, for all international treaties denouncing the practice, there are no mechanisms to enforce it or active sanctions for countries that still allow it. There is also a reluctance to criminalize it, especially due to the imbalance of power and funding of parent-led organizations, many of whom advocate for the practice or stay silent on the topic, while disabled-led organizations, which tend to be underfunded and without as much influence in policy. Then I'm going to talk about participation and why it's important the participation that persons with disabilities had in the change of this law. There is a chronic absence of academic research that covers how women and girls with disability are being forced into this practice. So by involving disabled advocates and organizations who are actively involved with the disability community and women and girls with disability who are at risk of being forcibly sterilized, we are able to identify specific situations that can lead to this harmful practice and ensure legislation was written considering this. I was one of the women with disabilities fighting against this practice who was invited to be involved in the change of legislation in Malta, as well as other advocates and the Engage team, which is a participatory forum for disabled people in Malta, directly involved in governmental decisions affecting the disability sector. We identified several possible agents involved in in enforcing sterilizations from carers or parents concerned about abuse to institutions who requested as a standard for acceptance to facilitate care. So when a person is accepted to enter and be institutionalized, some institutions require that to be easier for them and to not risk pregnancy. To medical professionals suggesting it to carers, which showed, and this showed us the importance of including accomplices in the legislation, because it's not just the doctor that performs it. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of situations that lead to coercion and enforcing this practice. Forced sterilization does not protect women with disabilities from abuse. And in fact might increase their targeting due to inability to get pregnant, which is a proof of the abuse itself. So there's not enough research on this, but it is a possibility that they are actually going to be more prone to abuse since it's less risk for the abuser. And invasive procedures should also not be allowed to facilitate care or menstrual management. Some of these being described as health reasons, with at least one woman we identify as being sterilized for leaving menstruation in the bed of one of her family members during the night. And this shouldn't be a situation that requires sterilization, and there's many other options to deal with the menstrual cycle, contraception, etc. It is also important to consider that forced sterilization can also happen through the consent of the person, but due to pressure or by not providing information on what the procedure will do to their body and fertility. So we identified women and girls that were pressured into consenting. They were made to believe that because they were disabled, they couldn't be mothers. They were not be good enough mothers, and so they needed to go through this. Or they were not fully informed or clearly informed about the procedure, or they were not informed at all, with some women thinking that they were doing an appendectomy instead of actually ending their fertility. And so this is some of the paths. There was many more that we identified to ensure that the legislation would be informed by lived experiences and by the situations that lead to this practice. So about the law itself in Malta, the law changes in Malta defines free and informed consent and specified that no substitution of such is allowed further to Article 25 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the general comment number 1 thereof. Substituted decision-making is a legal institute that allows a legal guardian, a family member, institution worker, or other to make decisions for the person with disability, with variability in restrictions between state members. So, first of all, the change in law specifies that there is no substitution of consent, and it's only the person that is able to provide consent. In Malta, the surgical removal or disablement of a minor or adult's reproductive organs without a person free and informed consent leading to sterilization leads to a person being guilty of enforced sterilization and being liable to imprisonment from 5 to 9 years with the possibility of a fine. Accomplices are also covered under this offense. The punishment increases by 1 degree up to a maximum of 12 years when the commission of such crimes involve also the use of force, deceit, fraud, bribery, false pretenses, coercion, or threats. The court can additionally impose a fine of between 8,000 and 20,000 euros and a compensation of up to 10,000 euros to the victim. This some of the points here. So it was included accomplices because there's a lot of people that lead to the enforcement of this practice. It was important that it led to imprisonment and not just fines, because we want to ensure that this will be properly criminalized and there's actually an accountability because of it. And and the compensation of the survivor or the victim, because at the moment we do have a lot of victims and survivors that no compensation or support was given to them after the enforced sterilization. So what does free and informed consent means in the context of this law? So consent reflecting the will and preference of the adult person, freely given directly by said adult person in respect of a surgical procedure that adult person might undergo, which may lead to sterilization, and it was given after said adult person has been provided with prior information in respect of the purpose and nature of the procedure, as well as its consequences, risks, and alternative options thereof, in a manner that is appropriate, accessible, and easy to understand for that adult person, including as necessary through non-conventional methods of communication and access to independent support from third parties. It can be withdrawn at any moment prior to the procedure, following its initially having been given, with said possibility having been likewise communicated to the adult person alongside the information indicated above. So as you can see, we ensure that in the law, it was ensured that the person knows the consequences, knows the risks, alternative options, because some of them are not giving the full information, and accessible information and communication, which with a lot of people not receiving appropriate accessible information and procedures to receive the consent. There is an exception to this provision, which is in the case that the procedure is not performed with the purpose of achieving enforced sterilization in terms of this article, and would have been otherwise deemed medically necessary for one or more medical professionals in accordance with the applicable standard of care, with such standard following established medical practices, and with such medical intervention consisting of one or more procedures, and which has the aim of saving and preserving the life of an adult person or of a minor person in the immediate or longer term. And follows established medical procedure practice with regard to the granting of informed consent by the patient in terms of other legislation. So this exception is to safeguard the need for surgical procedures required to save the life of the patient. For example, if during birth there is a complication leading to the need for a hysterectomy to save the life of the mother who has a disability, it's important that we ensure that the doctor is able to perform that life-saving procedure. Some women with disabilities might simply not wish to have children, or might have a disability or chronic condition that increases the probability of complications during pregnancy and birth and not want to risk it. As such, it is essential to not fully criminalize sterilization for all women with disabilities, but only when consent is not provided by the person. So what this does is there's an exception to save the life of the person. If it's possible that the person is able to give consent, they still need to search for consent and to get the procedure. But consent is the main point here. It's needed in every step of the way and by the person, and no one else can give that consent for her or him. So in conclusion, to finish, I would like to address a call to all countries and jurisdictions to ensure the criminalization of forced sterilization, the shifting of legal capacity laws towards supported decision-making, and provide accessible information and education on relationships and on sexual and reproductive health for persons with disabilities, especially for women and girls with disabilities. The participation of persons with disabilities in processes leading to the adoption of legislation, policy, and strategies is not enough anymore. Instead, leadership is essential to capture all the needs and priorities our community has, with this being even more important in situations where there is not enough data and research, such as for sterilization. Community-led policy is what every governmental entity should aspire to commit to in the upcoming years, and it is how we can end forced sterilization and other harmful practices against persons with disabilities, especially against women and girls with disabilities. Thank you so much for listening to me. My email is on the screen, and I'm open for any questions and contacts you wish to make. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Sarah for that very insightful presentation. I think you can agree the policy and legislative landscape in relation to sterilisation is critically important to address the profound impact of sterilisation on disabled women. I think there's themes across all of the presentations we've heard so far, the importance of consent, and what does consent really mean in these contexts, particularly how consent can be circumvented and subverted. I think we can see patterns across all of the speakers so far. And I think Sarah shone a really important light on while legislation is critical, leadership is as absolutely essential to be able to change the profound impact this has on people. So we're going to move on to our final speaker, Maho Rivas, who is from NASC, which is the Migrant and Refugee Rights Centre. Maho is going to talk to us about the barriers facing migrants and asylum seekers with disabilities in Ireland accessing reproductive care. Thank you, Maho.
Now, is this a mic? Or is this the mic? The two? Okay. I'm like, I am very short. Okay, so hello, my name is Maho. How are you? So I work for NASC, the Migrant Refugee Rights Centre. We're based in Cork. That is the actual capital of this country. So I just wanted to talk a bit about reproductive justice and the intersections between disability and migration. Okay. So just before I start, I guess I just want to clarify, I am, I have my law degrees and everything, but above all, I am a frontline practitioner. So I work with people directly. I go to the social welfare offices. I go to the immigration office. I have the pleasure of having to do so many reviews and appeals every day and quoting government legislation and operational guidelines to government officials. So this is all kind of informed by that work. So just an agenda. First of all, I want to start with some disclaimers. I want to give you the scope in terms of what I wanted to talk to you about. I bet you didn't sign up for a crash course on both social welfare and immigration in Ireland, but here you are. And then a bit about social welfare, disability and reproductive justice, when immigration meets social welfare, tiny bit on poverty, interesting case law or papers. I feel like maybe I was a teacher in a past life and I give homework to people. And then an inspiring quote to finish, because I'm going to talk about sad and frustrating things. So, it's always nice to end up on that. I guess the inspiration for this and a lot of my life is me on social media or in real life being, did you know, and go on and talk about the barriers or the legal restrictions for migrants accessing things that everyone else takes for granted. So this is that heightened, okay? So first of all, I just wanted to start saying, what we currently have available for people who are not migrants isn't ideal. I think we've heard about it. It's not ideal, but even the not ideal is not available for some migrant populations. Above all, this is an invitation to consider intersectionality and how barriers can be compounded. It's, and I think there is this idea for some people that you are either disabled or a migrant, and it's like, you can be both. And then there's gender, and there are many other things that can come together. So we know that disabled people aren't homogenous, nor are migrants. So there are many types of, and you're going to see it in the crash course, there are many types of migrants and even legal distinctions. So I'll be talking about legal and regulatory barriers to access to financial assistance from the state. So that is social welfare for short, here in Ireland, for specific classes of migrants. Now, this is the law and the regulation. I think we have heard before, especially from Hannah, she was saying, you know, you can change the law, but even if the law is on your side, you do have cultures, systems, barriers, and like, that's why I have to do appeals and reviews every day, even when the law is on my side. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because I think a lot of people are unaware, even people in Ireland, people who are practicing here, and we cannot change what we're not aware of. So if I could just get a quick show of hands, who would consider themselves familiar with the Irish social welfare system? If I could get a hand. Of those of you who would be familiar with migration and social welfare together? 2 hands, 3, great. So, great. So the scope, when I was talking to Eleanor, I was like, oh my God, I could talk about so many things. But she was like, you only have 20 minutes. And then I've just been told I only have 15. So I took the kind of like reproductive justice, and Eleanor was talking about this definition, you know, about the human right to maintain bodily autonomy, having children, not having them. And I guess I'm going to focus on the having children and the parenting of the children that we have in safe and sustainable communities. I could talk about so many things, about health. Please ask me about medical cards, housing supports, accessing care, taxes, but I'm going to be talking about like a segment of a segment, and that is financial supports. So far, everyone with me? Yeah, okay. So social welfare. So the crash course is this. In Ireland, we have a couple of types of social welfare payments. So one of them is social insurance. It's called PRSI. So that's the one that you contribute through work. Social assistance is, it doesn't matter if you've ever worked, but they test your means. So they see how much money you have coming in. You're a millionaire, you don't qualify. And then there's a couple of odd ones that don't fit. Odd ones is my wording, that don't fit into those, and those would be child benefit and domiciliary care allowance. So in 2004, Ireland introduced a condition that is called the Habitual Residency Condition, HRC for short, which restricts who cannot access most of the social assistance payments, including rent supplement and, worryingly so, child benefit. So child benefit is a, quote, universal payment for people who have children. You're going to see that it's not universal. There are a couple of exceptions, and those are just these 2 payments. So the exceptional needs payment, which is an emergency payment, it's a one-off. There's an emergency, you get it once. If you need it more times, you have to apply a lovely yellow form every time. And the daily expenses allowance, which is a payment that is given to people who are in the asylum system while they are living in state accommodation. You're not in state accommodation, you don't get it. Before moving on to HRC, the Social Welfare Office checks your right to reside. Do you have a right to live here? Okay. And the international protection applicants, we also know them as IPAs or asylum seekers, they were specifically, legislatively, like in the law, designated as not meeting HRC in 2009. So from 2009, the Irish Parliament and government decided that asylum seekers, just computer says no, they do not meet that criteria. The crash course on immigration. So when we talk about immigration, we have a few categories, and I will be talking about, I'm not going to be talking about all of them, but I just wanted to kind of like show you a bit of what it looks like. So you could be undocumented. That means that you don't have formally status in Ireland. You could be an asylum seeker, an international protection applicant. That means that you're waiting for your refugee claim to be processed. You could be a beneficiary of temporary protection. This is a very new status, so it's for people who are coming from Ukraine. You have your stamps. People who love immigration will be like your stamp 2, your stamp 1, employment permit holders, international students. Stamp 3 are your dependents. EU citizens, and finally Irish and UK citizens. So UK citizens are the only immigrants who have an unqualified right to reside in this country, and they're treated just like an Irish citizen. So you're going to see on the other column that we have the issues that are coming up. So the people who are undocumented, they have no right to reside. So they don't move even on to the next step when we're looking at social welfare claims. International protection applicants, as we said earlier, the law designated them as not meeting this condition. Just doesn't matter how long you've been here. You could be here for 10 years in the system. You don't meet it. People who are beneficiaries of temporary protection, it was great to see how when we have political willpower, people who just arrived to the country can have the right to work and meet the habitual residence condition and have an access to the full range of social welfare payments. However, since the 14th of March of this year, there will be a reduced rate for people who are coming from Ukraine. We have students, dependents, unemployment permit holders. They technically have a right to reside in Ireland. They could meet the habitual residency condition. Sometimes social welfare offices will refuse them, which is incorrect, and we can talk about that later. But for them, accessing a social welfare payment can be a breach of their immigration permission. And while it may not harm them at that point, when they want to renew their status, they could get in trouble if they accessed government supports. And that includes not only social welfare, but medical cards, housing, a bunch of other things. And EU citizens, they have to meet a EU immigration law, among them the directive. So just the same slide, the people that I want to talk about. So these are the people that I'm more worried about. Doesn't mean that everyone else doesn't face problems, but these are the people who cannot access support. So we have people who are undocumented, asylum seekers, people from Ukraine who arrived after March, and those three categories who do have a permission are working, some of them, and contributing into our systems, but they cannot access payments. And what's their situation? So that's going to be the next slide. So when I was looking at reproductive justice, and I was like, okay, I'm going to focus on a few payments just so that we can get a sense of them. So I thought, look, reproductive justice, I'm going to focus on disability, care, and parenting. So these are the payments that I wanted to talk to you about. So we have child benefit, which is the payment that you get when you have a child, disability allowance, blind pension, carer's allowance if you're caring for someone, domiciliary care allowance if you're caring for a child who's under 16 who needs more care than a child of the same age. That's kind of the regulation. One parent family, that is for people who are parenting on their own. Supplementary welfare allowance, and then the extra bits that come with those. So you free travel, household benefit, and fuel allowance. I love a good bit of social welfare. Yes, I am so fun at parties, I promise. So when we look at the people that we were talking about when it comes to immigration, so people who are undocumented, they can only access the exceptional needs payment. And it has 3 stars because that is if they have a PPSN, that's a number, an identifier, like a social security number if you're in other countries. And they have no fear of approaching the authorities, which if you're undocumented, even if you might have access to something, you might fear approaching them. People who are asylum seekers, they're only entitled to €38.80 if they're an adult, or €29.80 if you're a child, only if you're in state accommodation, which we call direct provision. But as some of you, if you're following the news, you may have seen that there are thousands of people, especially single men, but there are people who are not able to avail of state accommodation. So they don't get that money. And I guess when we were talking earlier about, and this is very real, I guess, I know some people earlier were talking about prenatal care and accessing appointments and all of that. And these are the enablers to do that. And I've found myself, along with other practitioners, struggling to get exceptional needs payments. Those are the one-off payments for pregnant people who are asylum seekers who live far away from the hospital to access prenatal appointments. and they have to pay for a taxi because the bus connections are shocking from that 38.80. And then I am surprised that some people are shocked that we have higher rates of maternal mortality and morbidity among migrant and ethnic minority women and people who get pregnant. So I wonder why. Then we have people who are beneficiaries of temporary protection. Basically, they're entitled to those same small payments, but they also get child benefit. So the people who are asylum seekers, they don't even get child benefit, a payment that we consider universal, quote, in Ireland. And we have this whole thing when we became a state. I'm Irish now, so I'm like, I'm owning this too. We cherish every child, yet children who are the children of undocumented people and the children of asylum seekers do not access child benefit, a payment that we consider universal. And then we have these people who have a right to reside, they're contributing to our economy, they're doing everything they should be doing. Employment permit holders are people that we have designated as people that we need in this country to keep it moving, working. They risk their immigration permission if they were to access any of these payments. So please tell this to people at parties when you're with them. So, you know, kind of like a couple of brief notes on poverty, and this was a definition by the government of Ireland itself in '97. And they talk about, you know, people living in poverty and having their income and resources so inadequate as to preclude them from having a standard of living which is regarded as acceptable by Irish society. And as a result of inadequate income and resources, people may be excluded and marginalized from participating in activities which are considered the norm for other people in society, like attending prenatal appointments. There are, and I'm not gonna, you know, you can do some recreational reading later, you can see a lot, there's a lot of documentation around the experiences of people who are living in direct provision, who are asylum seekers, less so of people with other immigration status, people who are undocumented, people who are international students, people who are employment permit holders and their dependents. We don't have as much evidence on those, but if you can't even access the payments that we were talking here, I think we can look at. Oh no, they're weekly. Yeah, yeah, loving questions, yes. So these amounts, 38.80, that is weekly. And the assumption was that because your room and your board are covered, that will cover everything else. So you have to pay your telephone bill, your bus, your appointment, if you want to eat the food that you want to eat and not the one that is cooked at the center, you have to cover it with that. Great. Sorry? Oh, let's not. This is what I was saying, you know, kind of like, how much time do I got? So that's why I'm talking only about social welfare, but I would be delighted to rant about all of this a bit more. As you can see, again, fun at parties. So that's on poverty. And I guess when we're looking at poverty, when we're looking at other aspects of it, like housing and migration, like there's a fair bit of evidence in this country about the increased risk that migrants find ourselves at. So migrants are at higher risk of poverty than people who are Irish born, although some people born in Ireland are not Irish because of after 2005 referendum. Overall, migrants are much less likely to own their own home, and because they don't own their own home, they also face more issues relating to the affordability of their housing. So 29% of migrants spend more than 30% of their income on housing compared to 8% of the Irish-born population. And this is what I was saying about earlier, what I was talking about, you know, kind of like the intersections, you know, like who is at a higher risk of poverty in Ireland? It is, you know, we've seen migrants, one-parent families, disabled people, people who are renting, and people who are unemployed. You could be all of those and find yourself at that intersection. So just if you really want to do your recreational reading later, there is very interesting case law and papers and reports. They're mostly focused on people in the asylum system, as I was saying earlier. So just to address some of the questions, so they might say, but people in the asylum system can work. So the right to work was only introduced in 2007 after the government was taken all the way to the Supreme Court to lift that ban. But what if you can't work? Because of caring, because of parenting on your own, because of your disability and the lack of accessibility of employers or of the centre where you're living. But what about Irish citizen children living in direct provision? They are not entitled to child benefit. So there's a really interesting case there. Now, we could just change the law, right? There's a lot there in terms of child poverty and exclusion, a lovely report that is entitled State-Sanctioned Poverty and Exclusion by Samantha Arnold in the Refugee Council. Keelan Barry, I know you'll have the pleasure of hearing her talk. I don't know, is she here? She's online. She's amazing. So there's a link there. Basically, anything Keelan writes, I love. So she talks a lot about vulnerability assessments, which is a legal requirement, the invisibility of disabled children and adult asylum seekers. And there you're going to find the information around accessing mobility aids or accessibility within the accommodation centres. And lastly, I just want to give you a bit of hope. Things weren't always like this. There is a lovely paper by Liam Thornton where he describes how we got to where we are. Before 2004, kind of like early 2000s, before then, people who were in the asylum system had access to the same social welfare payments as everyone else. And migrants, you know. So I think it just to give you a bit of hope, you know, this was all been sad and frustrating. So you cannot finish one of these without an inspiring quote, because I don't want you all to say Maho made me very sad. I did my law degree in South America, so we're very familiar with the lawyer's 10 commandments, and my favorite one is this one. The commandments were written by Eduardo Juan Couture Echeverri, and he said, "Your duty is to fight for the law, but the day that you find the law in conflict with justice, you fight for justice." And in a room full of amazing people that are working with the law, I really hope that this is an inspiring call to get ourselves informed about whatever context we're working on, to know what the law is, because we cannot change what we don't know, and hopefully spread the word and make people aware of the barriers that migrants and refugees are facing on top of everything else, wherever we're coming from. So thank you.